Welcome to Roll for Insight, the D&D podcast where we dive into the game, the lore, and the internet's favorite arguments. Grab your dice and your character sheet, and let's roll for insight. Hello, welcome to Roll for Insight. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the blind fighting style from the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook. Now, there are 10 fighting styles outlined in the handbook, and they're typically available to classes like fighters, paladins, rangers, and they're designed to give you a specific combat advantage or a specialization. So in this episode, we'll cover the prerequisite and rules for blind fighting. We'll talk about key rules like darkness, cover, and the blinded condition. We'll go through some gameplay examples and benefits and limitations. And of course, we'll pull some opinions from the internet, and we'll end on some fun fact information. Okay, so first topic, the prerequisite and description. So to take blind fighting, you must have access to the fighting style feature. So classes like Fighter get this at level 1, and classes like the Paladin and Ranger get this at level 2. Now, the fighting style description is very straightforward. You gain blind sight with a range of 10 feet. So now the question is, what is blind sight? So as per the description, if you have blind sight, you can see within a specific range without relying on physical sight. Within that range, you can see anything that isn't behind total cover, even if you have the blinded condition or are in darkness. Moreover, in that range, you can see something that has the invisible condition. So, blind fighting gives you blind sight, which allows you to see within 10 feet without relying on physical sight. And within that 10 feet, you can see in darkness, you can see while you're blinded, you can see invisible creatures, and you can see anything that's not behind total covered. So that's the main limitation. Blind sight ignores the vision problems, but it does not ignore the solid objects that might block your line of sight. Now, it's also important to understand the rules around this and what we're specifically impacting here with things like darkness and the heavily obscured condition. So darkness is equivalent to being heavily obscured, and other examples of things that might cause the same effect are things like heavy fog or smoke or dense foliage. And while you're in the heavily obscured areas, you effectively have the blinded condition. So now let's talk about the blinded condition. So there's two major effects. The first is you can't see. So you automatically fail ability checks that require sight. And then the second thing is your attacks are affected. So attack rolls against you have advantage, and your attack rolls have disadvantage. So what blind fighting does is when you're within 10 feet, you ignore those penalties completely. So you attack normally, enemies don't get advantage from your blindness, and you can see, I'll put that in quotations, normally, because it's not just with your eyes, you're tapping into your other senses, essentially. Now, a quick recap on the rules for cover, because blind sight does still respect the cover aspect, so this does matter. So there's essentially 3 levels of cover. The first is half cover, where you get +2 to armor class and your dexterity saving throws. And to get that half cover bonus, you have to quite literally have something covering about half of the target. So as an example, an enemy could be partially behind a pillar, or you could be shooting past another creature, so that blocks a little bit of your line of sight. The next level is 3/4 cover, where you get +5 to armor class and dexterity saving throws. And again, quite literally, something has to cover about 3/4 of the target. So an enemy could mostly be behind a wall or a barricade, or you could be peeking around from behind a doorway. So there is some level of DM discretion here. And then the highest level of cover is total cover, where you cannot be targeted. If you are, for example, fully behind a wall, or you're around a corner or behind a closed door. So even with blind sight, you can't see or target them if they're behind total cover. Blind sight doesn't mean you have the ability to see through objects, you're just hyper aware of things in your immediate vicinity here. So now let's talk about some actual gameplay scenarios here. So if you're looking at combat, the big one is fighting in magical darkness. So normally you would have disadvantage to attack and enemies have advantage. Now with blind fighting, there's no penalties within 10 feet. And that can be extremely strong when you pair it with things like spells that create obscurement like darkness or fog cloud, and it allows your casters to throw out these spells a little bit more freely or intentionally, and then you can wade into combat without those penalties. But again, your enemies will generally still be impacted unless they also happen to have something to mitigate that obscurement. Now, another big one is fighting invisible creatures. So, blind fighting is also quite strong against enemies that rely on those types of abilities to be more dangerous. So, some invisible threats that are pretty common would be things like invisible spellcasters or rogues using invisibility effects, or there are some creatures like invisible stalkers and certain types of fae and fiends that have invisibility. So, normally you'd be attacking at disadvantage, but with blind fighting, you're attacking normally as long as the enemy is within those 10 feet. Now, we did mention the other couple of environmental effects that can impact visibility, like fog or smoke, or dense foliage, or forests. So sometimes characters are going to be struggling here, but the idea is that you don't. Now, there's also some out-of-combat uses, and this is often overlooked because you can detect invisible creatures nearby or objects within that range. So you can see something that has the invisible condition. Now, you can also navigate in darkness without light, being able to see 10 feet ahead, and you can function while you're blinded, either temporarily or permanently. And that can come up in a couple scenarios and campaign styles, like the trap-heavy dungeons or the magical darkness zones, or if there's some stealth or infiltration scenarios where you absolutely do not want to be lighting up the area, now you have the upper hand. So there's some benefits and limitations here that should be fairly obvious. The benefits being it negates that disadvantage in darkness and blindness, and it counters invisibility, whether it's creatures or objects within 10 feet. And now, since it's a passive resource, there's no cost to it, so you're not expending a certain amount of uses per day. So it's really reliable in the poor visibility environments. So it works well in and out of combat, and it can be situationally powerful, but it's always on. And then it's both a defensive and an offensive tool for you. Now, limitations, it does only work within 10 feet, so it's not a huge range, and it doesn't bypass total cover. So you're going to find it less useful if you are in the well-lit and open environments more often, and it doesn't increase your damage output directly besides countering your advantage or disadvantage. So if enemies are staying at range, you're going to get a little bit less value out of this one. All right, now let's jump over to some opinions from the internet here on the blind fighting feat. So a very common take is that it's very campaign dependent, and that one's totally fair because this is an amazing feat to take if you're in the darkness heavy or the magic heavy campaigns where people throw around the fog clouds and the darkness spells all the time. But it can be pretty underwhelming if you're often in the bright open environments or your campaign just doesn't really worry about those kinds of rules. And that's totally fair. So yeah, if you're not likely to be in those scenarios very often, then this is not a very good pick. Or if you don't have casters in your party who like to throw down the fog clouds in the darkness, then yes, it will have limited applications. Now, fighters, for example, can trade out their fighting styles on level up, so you do have a little bit more flexibility to grow into or out of this role as well. Now, another pretty common take here is that people are highlighting that this is a pretty hard counter to invisibility. So that is a huge major advantage taken away from the invisible enemies. It's especially useful at tables where invisibility shows up pretty frequently. But a common take to that is that the range is too short. So the criticism is that the 10 feet feels pretty limiting. And that's fair, but most melee combat happens within that 10-foot range anyways. So in general, it seems like blind fighting is received pretty positively because it does turn you into that reliable frontliner here, and a lot of players like it because you're not affected by the conditions that disrupt other people, and then you remain really consistent on the battlefield when things get chaotic with those environmental effects. So let's wrap things up today with a fun fact about blind sight. So blind sight is commonly associated with creatures like bats and oozes, and there's certain aberrations as well, and those creatures don't rely on vision, but they sense their surroundings in other ways like echolocation. Now, the blind warrior or the seer archetype is also quite classic, and there's a lot of mythologies and folklores that dip into this one. It's where the loss of physical sight is then compensated by the person having some sort of like enhanced spiritual insight and senses. So some classic examples are Tiresias from Greek mythology. So it's one of the more famous examples. He's the Theban prophet who was blinded by the gods and is sometimes Hera, sometimes Athena, but then granted the gift of prophecy in return. Now, Odin from Norse mythology, while he was not totally blind, he did sacrifice one eye to gain cosmic knowledge and wisdom. And then, of course, continuing that tradition through to superheroes today, probably one of the more popular examples is Daredevil. Well, that's it for this session of Roll for Insight. Thanks for listening, and thank you to all our supporters on patreon.com/rollforinsightpodcast. And we will see you next time.